Good afternoon and welcome to the new school and to the 33rd Social Research Conference. We've started this series in 1989 and it's been going strong ever since. And today, as you know, we're beginning our conference on sanctions and divestments, a topic that's very much on our minds, given what's going on with Iran and what recently the historic events having to do with Cuba. But before I turn the microphone over to our moderator for the session and the speakers, I just would like to say a word about Social Research Journal, which is the parent of the conference series. Social Research has been the journal of the New School for Social Research, formerly known as the graduate faculty of the New School for Social Research, formerly known as the University in Exile. And the journal was actually started by the first president of the New School and that University in Exile faculty, which was a very small faculty made up of scholars and intellectuals that Alvin Johnson, the first president of the New School, had managed to bring out of Germany. The University in Exile was organized at the New School in 1933. And the journal was initiated by that faculty in 1934, and it was meant to be a public voice of the New School, of the University in Exile faculty, and that what then became the graduate faculty of the New School. We, in fact, just celebrated the 80th anniversary of the journal. And I must say, I'm gladly able to say that the journal continues to thrive at a time when little journals and academic journals are having a rough go. Our mission from the start with this conference series has been fostering discussions of matters of serious public concern by exploring them whenever possible in their historical and cultural contexts. Usually papers from our conferences are published in special issues of Social Research. This one is no exception, except that the journal issue, which is going to be our winter 2015 issue on sanctions and divestment, has papers by authors who are not speaking at the conference, and some of the people speaking at the conference have not written for the journal. That's quite unusual for us, but I think both are going to be extremely valuable. Let me say something also very quickly about the choice of today's conference topic. Although maybe it doesn't need any explanation, but oddly, when we began to talk about doing an issue of the journal and a conference on sanctions and divestment, there was not quite as much media coverage and discussions about the effectiveness and advisability of sanctions as there is today. So in that sense, in some perverse way, we were lucky. Because, of course, they figure prominently in our negotiations with Iran over their nuclear capacity and the lifting of decades-old sanctions against Cuba. There are also sanctions now levied against Russia for its incursion into Iran and movements to divest in fossil fuels, as well as a divestment movement relating to Israel. And all of those will be discussed in in future sessions at this conference. So the conference, as I envisioned it, will talk about and try to perhaps, by the end of it, we will have some sense of why sanctions are used so frequently now and when, if ever, they are effective and why they are effective, when they're effective and why they aren't. I just want to give you notice that there is one more session today after this one, and then there is a reception to which you're all invited, which is just across the courtyard. It's part of the New School building, to which you're all welcomed. It begins at 5:30. And I would also, of course, like to thank the funders who made this conference possible. We are unable to do conferences at the New School without the foundation support, and we are very lucky to have gotten support for this conference from Rockefeller Brothers Fund and from Open Society Funds, and we're grateful, extremely grateful, and obviously also grateful to the speakers who are going to be talking with you today. And now it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Sakiko Fukuda-Parr, who will moderate the first session. Sakiko is a professor, my colleague, she's a professor of international affairs at the New School. From 1995 to 2004, she was lead author and director of the UNDP Human Development Reports. And prior to that, she worked at the World Bank with UNDP on agriculture, aid coordination in Africa, and capacity development. I won't go on. She's a very, very distinguished and important person in the development world, and it's my great pleasure to introduce her and to let her then introduce the speakers.
Well, for now, perhaps I will speak from here, but later on I'll just stay at my chair. So welcome to this first session. When Aryeh asked me if I would moderate this panel, I readily said yes, because I think as somebody who's worked on development, human development, and human rights, sanctions have always been this difficult topic. There is a long history of sanctions that we will hear about very shortly, and in practice, they have applied in ways that have sometimes been effective and sometimes less effective. But I think what's most important to keep in mind is that they have all kinds of unintended consequences, so that the policy objective of sanction may be to change the behavior of political leaders, but they also have all kinds of impacts on the human rights of the population, and very often the poor and the vulnerable. So this is a kind of a blunt instrument that has had many different unintended consequences. But I think there has also been a very important evolution in the design of these tools, so that that they actually have greater, more targeted effect with less of these unintended consequences. But anyway, let me get on to introducing our speakers. We have 3 speakers for this session. Professor Dan Drezner will be the first to speak. He's professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and also senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And he's also a contributing editor at the Washington Post. He also, prior to the Fletcher School, he was at Colorado, and the Civic Education Fund Project, the RAND Corporation, U.S. Department of Treasury, and so on. He has had fellowships from the German Marshall Fund, the Council on Foreign Relations, Harvard University. He's an author of 5 books, including All Politics Are Global and Theories of International Politics and Zombies. That's just one that I think is very interesting. So he will be talking about sanctions as an economic weapon, an overview. The second speaker is Reid Capalino, who is an energy investment analyst working in private, public, and not-for-profit sectors. He contributes to Carbon Tracker's work, evaluating the impact on fossil fuel assets at company and project level as a result of transition to low-carbon economy. He will be talking about divestment as a strategy to address climate change. And our final speaker for this session is Aryeh Neier, who really needs no introduction. He, as many of us know, has been president of the Open Society Foundation, and he was executive director of Human Rights Watch, and in fact, a founding director. He has a very long and distinguished track record as a champion of human rights in this country. And so he will be speaking about the impact of sanctions on human rights. So, Dan, the floor is yours, and you have 20 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you also to Aryeh Mack and the Center for Public Scholarship for having me here. I'm one of those people that is speaking but did not contribute to the special issue. For the record, though, I have in the past contributed to a special issue of social research, and that was easily the strangest article I've ever written because it was about the role of the zombie metaphor in public policy discourse. So I very much appreciate Aryeh's invitation to demonstrate that I can talk about something other than zombies to an audience, which I appreciate. We can start at the beginning with respect to sanctions, which is in December 1807, the Jefferson administration, as well as the US Congress, was rather upset about the fact that British ships were continuing to seize and impress US sailors as well as US ships during the Napoleonic Wars. So they hit upon the bright idea of passing the 1807 Embargo Act, which essentially embargoed all imports and exports from the United States to Europe. And in some ways, the Embargo Act worked brilliantly. Exports declined by approximately 80% from the United States, and imports into the United States declined by more than half. Economic historians estimate that the Embargo Act hurt US GDP by approximately 5%, that the US GDP shrank by 5% as a result of the Embargo Act. Great Britain was not nearly as severely affected, and by March 1809, recognizing that this had been a ridiculously futile gesture, Congress revoked the Embargo Act without any British political concessions whatsoever. So the very first case of American sanctions was, without question, a spectacular failure. I'm not going to spend the next 5 hours talking about every other sanctions case. No, I'm not going to do that. But the point is that things have changed clearly in the last 2 centuries, that you can argue that in many ways we now live in a golden age of economic statecraft, as well as a golden age of studying economic statecraft. In terms of actual sanctions, it's hardly the United States that's alone in this. Other great powers like China or Russia or the European Union have become much more active in the last decade in terms of applying economic sanctions. But their activity in many ways pales beside the United States. And this is particularly the case with targeted financial sanctions. According to the US Office of Foreign Assets Control, which runs and manages these sanctions regimes, the number of OFAC cases has more than doubled between 2004 and 2014, from 17 to 37. And a quick scan of the OFAC website shows that in the last year alone, 20 different sanctions regimes have either been added or altered of some kind or another. Treasury officials now brag to the press openly about being, quote, at the center of our national security with respect to the implementation of sanctions. And as Aryeh said, the obvious cases like Russia and Iran, and even the less known cases like Venezuela, it's been very important. At the same time, the study of economic sanctions, I think, has also advanced. It used to be that a lot of work on sanctions essentially focused on a sort of high-profile case. Think about the UN embargo against South Africa or the US embargo on Cuba. And these were important cases, but there was a tendency to sort of inductively derive generalizations from those high-profile cases. And in some instances, those high-profile cases are somewhat atypical. There's now a much larger wealth of both theories of economic sanctions, but more importantly, a lot of data. The Peterson Institute for International Economics, as well as Rice University, have acquired or developed significant sanctions databases. The UN Targeted Sanctions Initiative, which is a consortium of different graduate schools, has also worked on the UN side. And in many ways, this has actually been a model, you can argue, in terms of policymaking of bridging the gap, of an instance where policymakers have relied on scholars and then taken the input and advisement from scholars to refine their sanctions. As Jeffrey Schott, who is at the Peterson Institute and is one of the architects of that sanctions database, puts it, the U.S. has evolved from, and I quote, from a sort of undergraduate sanctions approach to a postgraduate, where the sanctions are much more potent. So what I am going to talk about is, first, how did we get here? Second, what do we know about the current potency of U.S.-imposed economic sanctions? And what are the big questions, or what should we be concerned about going forward? So in terms of how we got here, in some ways, targeted financial sanctions and sectoral sanctions is the sort of bastard child of two different streams of thought about this. The first and older one is what I would like to refer to as the brute force theory of sanctions, which essentially argues that if you maximize the pain on the target country, if you maximize the cost of the sanctions to be imposed on the target, you are more likely to get political concessions. This is very crude and it's simple, and it has the virtue of being somewhat true. If you actually take a look at the cost to the target, it's the sort of one variable that shows up as statistically robust in any sort of regression or any sort of statistical analysis you throw at it. The problem is that that's not the only thing that's going on. Costs to the target are not the only thing that are important in determining whether or not sanctions will actually succeed. There are other issues. Some are rather banal. For example, you actually need to be clear what you're asking for in terms of the sanctions, which again sounds ridiculously simple, except if you take a look at, let's say, the history of US sanctions against either Iraq or Iran, it was far from clear what we've been asking for in some cases. In other instances, the question was expectations of future conflict. To what extent did the target view the United States as an ally or an adversary going forward? And generally speaking, if they thought of it as an adversary, then even if the sanctions have been painful, concessions will be far fewer and far more grudging. But more importantly, and sort of a fatal flaw for the brute theory of sanctions was that Iraq happened. Essentially, the US sanctions and the UN-led sanctions that were imposed on Iraq were absolutely devastating in terms of both the economic and humanitarian impact. Easily the most powerful form of sanctions imposed from in the history of economic statecraft in 1990. And the way in which these sanctions were viewed by the world eventually came around to the idea that, in fact, Iraq was an innocent victim in all of this, and the United States was in some ways a very cruel butcher. This was not helped by Madeleine Albright on 60 Minutes, essentially when she was asked, was imposing the sanctions worth the cost of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children's lives? Madeleine Albright committed the ultimate Washington gaffe. She told the truth, and she said, yes, she thought it was worth it. And this was clearly a bit of a problem. The humanitarian impacts were devastating. It alienated, unsurprisingly, a variety of UN Security Council members. And as the other participants will talk about, there were massive negative externalities, not just humanitarian impact, but also in terms of corruption. Sanctions, particularly trade-based sanctions, by definition, outlaw what would otherwise be ordinary market activity. So the moment you impose a sanction, you are creating an incentive for black market activity, which is therefore an invitation for corruption for both public and private sector actors. It is not a coincidence that if you take a look at, let's say, the Transparency International Corruptions Perception Index, and you go all the way to the bottom to see who the most corrupt countries are, shockingly, most of them have been under some form of sanctions regime at some point in the last 10 years. And part of the problem is that the sanctions have a legacy effect. Even if you lift them, networks, economic networks have been developed and sort of geared towards rooting themselves around the sanctions. And so as a result, you create long-lasting effects. So with the brute theory, with the brute force theory sort of in decline, you saw the development of what were called smart sanctions. And who really would be opposed to smart sanctions? Because they sound so good. The idea here was that you would target the sanctions at elites. at people who are reasonably well off with the idea of sparing the population. And the way you would do this was, first, you would impose not a comprehensive trade embargo, but impose particular sanctions that would presumably hurt governments and supporters of the governments more than ordinary populations. Things like the sanctioning of luxury goods, or bans on international travel, or arms embargoes, or financial sanctions. And also, those sanctions wouldn't necessarily be applied against the entire government, but rather targeted entities, either individuals or government enterprises. The problem with these sanctions is that, on the one hand, they were designed to alleviate humanitarian impact, and in that sense, by and large, they are better than the brute force theory of sanctions. The problem is they work really badly. They don't work at all in terms of actually generating concessions. In fact, the UN Targeted Sanctions Database estimates their success rate at about 10% over the last 20 years, which is actually lower than the sort of traditional comprehensive sanctions. The one exception to this, at least in terms of actually imposing costs to the target, were targeted financial and sectoral sanctions, which is you went after an economy's financial sector, and if they were sort of a single crop economy, their primary export, either, let's say, oil in the case of Iran or Iraq, or cocoa in the case of, let's say, the Ivory Coast. These sanctions wound up actually really genuinely hurting elites more. And because they're financial sanctions, frankly, they're hurting the people with the money as opposed to the broad majority of people who have much less or don't even necessarily participate in formal finance. Furthermore, the market incentives of targeted financial sanctions work very differently than the market incentives for trade sanctions. As I said before, with trade sanctions, the moment you impose them, the incentive is to bust the sanctions. The incentive is to evade the law. Within the financial sector, though, if you impose financial sanctions, the financial sector finds itself with a very different set of incentives, particularly because it's the U.S. imposing them and because of the ultimate preeminence of U.S. capital markets. Frankly, banks in the United States and banks in Europe and banks elsewhere value access to U.S. capital markets a lot more than any illicit gain they could get from evading the sanctions. And in this sense, fines also matter. The U.S. has successfully fined Standard Chartered, HSBC, and most prominently BNP Paribas, all of which violated U.S.-imposed sanctions at one point or another to the tune of billions of dollars. So as a result, all of these banks, in making this calculation, would much rather adhere to the sanctions than potentially have an incentive to defect. And as a result, the other effect of this is that if targeted financial sanctions are announced, it's not just the impact of those financial sanctions, it's also that private capital winds up in some ways amplifying the effect of sanctions. So for example, in the case of Russia, if you actually take a look at what was done in terms of those sanctions, they weren't all that severe. But what happened was that private capital saw the handwriting on the wall, did not want to have their assets frozen in Russia, and as a result, more than $150 billion of capital left that country in 2014 alone, and that's not chump change. So the question is that there is no doubt that targeted financial sanctions pack a much greater wallop. But the question is, do they work in terms of actually generating political concessions? And it is easy to argue that, in fact, they do not work very well. Russia has shown no indication whatsoever that they are going to get out of the Crimea, or for that matter, eastern Ukraine. If you take a look at the Iran case, on the one hand, you have the interim deal that's been negotiated. On the other hand, you have various Iranian leaders doing everything possible to say, to set conditions that guarantee that final comprehensive deal won't be achieved upon. And if you take a look at, the ones that were actually imposed in Venezuela over the last few months, I think you could argue in the short term they actually backfired because they gave Maduro a perfect enemy to blame the collapse of the Venezuelan economy for. But in some ways, that's an unfair judge for two reasons. First of all, what's being asked of the target state in all of these cases is massive. Expecting sanctions to cause countries to give up territory is almost unheard of. They almost never works because asking a country to give up territory is in some ways goes to the core of what a nation state really is. Furthermore, in other cases, you're asking for regime change or relinquishing what could potentially be a viable nuclear program. These are huge demands. And only if you have some degree of compromise will the sanctions actually have any degree of success. The sanctions clearly have succeeded in imposing serious costs, however, and these costs matter if you think of the sanctions not as necessarily generating immediate political concessions from the target, but rather as a form of deterrence against other actors contemplating similar kinds of action. And indeed, this is explicitly how the United States has thought about these sanctions if you take a look, for example, at the 2015 National Security Strategy. In fact, they say, and they quote, The use of targeted sanctions and other coercive measures are meant not only to uphold international norms, but to deter threats to stability and order at the regional level. And there is at least some initial scholarly evidence that suggests that in both human rights and in non-proliferation, the imposition of sanctions potentially deters other possible targets from contemplating actions that would be considered problematic. So, am I doing okay on time? Okay, good. I will close then with just a couple of statements about future concerns. In other words, if these sanctions actually are potent, and even if they don't work in the case of Russia and Iran, they do work to deter other potential countries, what are the concerns going forward? The first is, frankly, figuring out whether this deterrent effect is real. As I said, the scholarly evidence seems to support it right now, but this is based on very few studies, and in part because these targeted financial measures are relatively novel. And so there needs to be more work on this, certainly more data. And of course, as a professor, I always want more scholarship on this. The second question is whether targeted financial sanctions are as smart as is often thought. In other words, do they actually not necessarily cause humanitarian suffering or problems in terms of human rights going forward? We know some evidence that suggests this to be true. But at the same time, if you think of authoritarian regimes and how they try to suppress dissent, they very often have one of two options. They can either use guns or outright coercion, or they can use butter. They can try to buy off populations, which is far more, far more benevolent in terms of the population. If you impose sanctions, you essentially are eliminating the butter option, which might cause many authoritarian regimes, even if they don't want to rely more on guns as a way to stay in power. I think the third question to ask is whether or not learning will take place. In some ways, the potency of targeted financial measures, if you take a look at the literature, took both the United States and the target countries by surprise. I don't think Iran expected the post-2010 sanctions to be as effective as they were. I certainly don't think Vladimir Putin expected the 2014 sanctions that were imposed to be as devastating on the Russian economy as they turned out to be. So in some ways, this evolves over time. The question is, to what extent will both the target state and the sender state adapt to the knowledge that these sanctions really have the potential of working? In some cases, this might, again, deter what would otherwise be countries from considering transgressive acts. On the other hand, it might be that if they actually do commit those transgressive acts, they're now fully aware of what the impact of those sanctions will be. I think two last things I would talk about. The first is, and this is a sort of far-off concern, but it's the future of U.S. financial power. In some ways, almost all of the targeted financial measures work because of the preeminence of U.S. capital markets and the preeminence of the U.S. dollar. Over time, if the U.S. continues to deploy sanction after sanction after sanction at the drop of a hat, there will be a fair amount of resentment that will well up about the fact that the United States seems to be the financial bully of the world. So far, most of the sanctions that the U.S. has actually imposed have had a fair amount of multilateral buy-in, and therefore, as a result, this concern, I think, has been somewhat mitigated. But that said, you are seeing signs of sort of financial balancing. Questions of countries trying to find ways to not be as reliant upon the dollar. Vladimir Putin has been the most explicit about this and has tried to cajole the other BRICS countries to be somewhat sympathetic to a world of, let's say, multiple reserve currencies. There has even been some grumbling in the European Union about the choice of targets, because in the case of both Iran and Russia, the simple fact is that the European Union trades a lot more with these countries than the United States does. And so as a result, the sanctions wind up having more costs on them. This hasn't happened yet. Let me stress the dollar is still in some ways the undisputed hegemon in terms of the international financial system. But it's a question of whether even the sort of concern about the possibility of this will act as a constraint on U.S. power. And the last point I would argue before I leave is that the other problem that we have to deal with is not just the imposition of sanctions, but also the eventual lifting of sanctions. The United States is really, really, really good at imposing economic sanctions, and we're not quite as good at lifting them. Part of this is because of who imposes the sanctions. In some cases, it's just the executive branch. But in most cases where you're talking about what would be considered longtime adversaries like Cuba or Iran, there's a whole welter of congressionally backed sanctions as well. They're very easy to impose and they're very hard to lift. Furthermore, the specter of financial sanctions is such that even when they are partially lifted, financial institutions are extremely reluctant to deal with those countries because they are worried about being named and shamed by the United States. So one of the things that I think has surprised Iran, for example, after the interim deal was supposed to release a certain amount of sanctions, allow Iran to be able to get credit in Western financial institutions, and they've been frustrated in doing this because banks in both the United States and Europe have been extremely reluctant to do business with Iran because they simply don't trust the notion that they'll be able to do this without getting punished by the United States. And in terms of the cases like Cuba and Iran, getting congressional buy-in ranges from difficult to impossible. So I think there needs to be as much enthusiasm in the United States about how to lift these sanctions as there is about how to impose them in the first place. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was a perfect start to, I think, this conference. So next we have Reid. He will talk about climate change.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Kudos to you all for being here on this fine spring day. All right, so Professor Drezner started us off with zombies, bastard children. I think we're off to a good start here. So I'm gonna move from the sanctions part of this conference to the divestment part, and I'm gonna focus on the fossil fuel divestment movement. To give a brief outline of the talk, I'll first introduce the Carbon Tracker Initiative, the group with which I work. We'll share my high-level takeaways on fossil fuel divestment as a strategy to address climate change, give a bit of background on the fossil fuel divestment movement, talk about key considerations for investors when thinking about this proposition, evaluate the role for investor engagement as either a complement or alternative to divestment from fossil fuel companies, and then end with some concluding thoughts. So briefly, just to share with you, Carbon Tracker Initiative. Anyone, can I see a show of hands? Anyone here familiar with our group? Okay, well, good. Get you introduced us to a new audience. We are a not-for-profit financial think tank that works to bring climate reality to the financial markets. We do this by publishing research, much of which I will talk about today, by working with investors and companies to think about long-term issues related to energy and climate, and by engaging with the policymakers and regulators to try to make the financial system more climate secure. So with that as context, let's talk about the fossil fuel divestment movement, which, given that the New School has well known and participated in this movement, I hope many of you are familiar with. In this talk, I'll articulate basically 4 points about fossil fuel divestment movement. The first one is that, in my view, by any standard, this movement over the past 3 years has been very successful at focusing public attention on moral issues related to climate change. So if anyone paid attention to the activities of the Divest Harvard campaign up in Boston 2 weeks ago, and to see Cornel West standing in Harvard Yard talking about the planetary Selma, powerful stuff. So this, I think by any measure, it's been, they've gotten a lot of public attention. That said, institutions like the New School and others with which I'll talk about have divested. Many, probably most investors are, in my view, unlikely to be swayed to embrace at least wholesale divestment, Harvard, for example, being one of them. The reasons for this range from wholesale divestment from fossil fuels being a relatively rough and broad measure to address climate change, to the fact that in many cases investors have legitimate questions about what effect divestment will have on the actual behavior of companies. So a lot of public focus, perhaps limited role for investor uptake, but it's important to recognize that alongside the rise of this idea of divestment over the past 3 years has also, less public focused on, but been adoption and development of increasingly assertive forms of what we would call investor engagement. So actions that shareholders can take to try to influence the business model and the activities of companies, but while maintaining ownership rather than selling ownership. And that going forward, I think both of these strategies, divestment, partial divestment, engagement, are all likely to be on the table for investors who are looking to think about climate risk and to take action on this issue. So those are the takeaways. which I will return to at the end. But let's now get into some of the substance. Where did this movement come from? Well, this is a chart from the Carbon Tracker Initiative, a report we put out in 2011, our first unburnable carbon report. And it was this report which Bill McKibben, to his credit, popularized in a Rolling Stone article in 2012 that then launched and has been cited by the fossil-free movement as providing the underpinnings for why divestment is a good idea. So a lot of stuff on this graph. I'll try to make it simple. The three key numbers. 2 degrees C, 225 billion tons of CO2, gigatons CO2, that's the green circle. 762 gigatons CO2, that's the blue circle. 2 degrees C, I hope many of you are familiar with. This is a level for global warming, a limit above pre-industrial levels that is regarded as something of an important threshold. 193 nations have recognized this as a valuable goal to which to aspire in the 2010 Cancun Accord. Bad things can happen before 2 degrees C. We've already had about 1 degree C of warming, but after 2 degrees C, they get worse. So that's the important threshold. What needs to be happened to adhere to that threshold? Well, we have to adhere to what we at Carbon Tracker would call a carbon budget, which means a limit on the amount of fossil fuels that can be burnt, emitted into the atmosphere. And for listed companies, that's fossil fuel companies that are wholly or partly listed on public exchanges, these companies own about 1/4 of global fossil fuel reserves. So we calculate that through 2050, emissions from those reserves should be no more than 225 billion tons. That's the green circle. For reference, total global emissions in 2014 were about 40 billion tons. So we got to stick to 225, the green circle. But these companies, in just their proven reserves, so reserves that we know we can extract today economically, they're already at the blue circle. So 762, i.e. 3 times. So the basic takeaway there is that in order to limit global warming to 2 degrees C at a high level, listed fossil fuel companies should be burning no more than 1/3 of their proven reserves through 2050. And I'm not even getting into the red circle, which is a broader category, which companies, the fossil fuel industry, is spending hundreds of billions of dollars each year to basically move the red circle into the blue circle, develop and produce new sources of reserves. This, in a nutshell, is a key challenge related to climate change. We're on a trajectory that's just not sustainable with adhering to this 2-degree target. So many of us who observe the issue, we all agree on that. The question is, what do you do about it? So the fossil-free movement, their answer to this question is, look, they say, the company is doing this, it's our money in many cases that owns the debt or the equity of these companies, so we don't want them spending the money to develop these reserves. Let's try to just take away the money, bottom line. I mean, the target of the fossil-free movement is generally the 200 largest publicly traded coal, oil, and gas companies. The goal is to get these companies to stop exploring for new hydrocarbons, to pledge to keep 80% of their proven reserves in the ground, and to stop lobbying to try to influence the political process. And the mechanics are basically stop new investments in debt and equity of these companies, and over 5 years wind down existing investments. It's a big ask, given that, as we'll talk about in a second, those companies comprise in the fossil fuel, coal, oil, and gas sectors about 8 to 13% of global equity markets. So it's not small change we're talking about here. It's a big ask, but to the surprise of many, and myself at times, as well, over the past 3 years, 200 or so, pardon me, getting ahead of myself. Before we get to that, let's just note for one moment, what's really the purpose of the divestment campaign? It's inherently an economic act, right? Divestment, you're buying, you're selling, it's an economic act. But I think that the movement really, and in their own literature, the fossil-free movement gets to this point. It's a moral and political campaign as much as it is an economic one. I think the goals are to highlight the moral implications of climate change, to build moral pressure on companies to change their business practices, and at the same time to build political momentum for solutions to address climate change. Many of the same folks who were leading the fossil-free movement, 5 years ago, they were leading efforts to lobby for cap-and-trade regime in the U.S. So it's those moral and political goals that I think are key. So that's the idea. Who has actually embraced divesting from fossil fuels? Well, about 200 institutions over the past 3 years, the New School among them, have embraced some form of divestment from fossil fuels. You see the categories here. I'll make just 2 observations about this. The first one is that relatively few of these institutions have done what the New School or what Charles, the Prince of Wales, has recently announced that he will do, which is to basically wholesale divest from fossil fuel holdings. Many of these institutions have gotten out of a portion of fossil fuels, for example, exited their coal holdings. Stanford, that is the action that Stanford University took with its endowment, or have exited a portion of the most carbon-intensive companies. Norway's sovereign wealth fund is exiting 22 coal, oil, and gas producers. That's the first observation. The second one is that the motives for why companies have done this, or pardon me, institutions have done this, they really vary. Some, make it, they say it's a clear value statement. This is, we don't want to be associated with, it's not right. Others, the pension funds and sovereign wealth funds among them are generally, they are more focused on the financial risks of maintaining investment in these companies. So it's a variety of motives, but this gives you a snapshot of who actually this movement has reached. So we talked about divestment so far. I'm going to move on now. That's all what's happened. Let's talk now about some of the challenges related to divestment as a solution to climate change. I'm going to focus primarily on the two issues in bold here, but just lest all of you don't spend all your time thinking about this, which I hope you don't, I'll go through briefly the other issues. I mean, the critiques of divestment from an economic perspective generally fall into two categories. The first one is to say, look, you're not addressing the problem, and it's really not going to have the intended effect. So we've already said that in a best case, listed companies, they control like 25% of fossil fuel reserves. The rest are controlled by state-owned companies, PDVSA, Venezuela, Iranian National Oil Company, all these countries against which we seem to be levying sanctions, which maybe someone wants to address. Anyhow, so that's the first point. Equity is not, when you sell a share of equity, someone else needs to buy it. It's not actually a new source of capital as opposed to debt, so you're not really affecting funds coming into these companies. People say, the amounts being targeted are arguably too small. The outstanding debt of the global oil and gas sector is in excess of $2 trillion. All university endowments in the U.S. are at $400 billion. It's a lot of money in this sector. And others say it's not practical for investors to adopt. It's just we can't exclude ourselves from that larger portion of the market. These are all criticisms against, many of which have validity. Happy to talk about them more in the Q&A. I want to focus, though, on two different but related issues. First one, and this is key to our work at Carbon Tracker, is this point that divestment, it's a broad measure that doesn't distinguish between what we would call high cost and low cost carbon. So between carbon that's within that green circle and carbon that's outside the green circle, which we think is very important to do. Second thing is that if you sell 100% of your holdings in companies, so you get out entirely, then you're sacrificing the potential to try to use dialogue, shareholder resolutions, or the other array of tools to influence the behavior of these companies. Full disclosure, it is possible, if you maintain very small stakes in these companies, to still, for example, file shareholder resolutions. That's what the Unitarian Universalist Church, the approach they've taken. But if you get it entirely, you can't move the needle via dialogue and engagement. Let's talk briefly about both of those points. I'll talk about engagement. I'll do concluding thoughts. This is high cost versus low cost carbon. We at Carbon Tracker are very focused on what we would call carbon supply cost curves. So this is from a report we put out a year ago. This is showing global oil production through 2050. You see millions of barrels a day and billions of tons of carbon on the x-axis, and what we call the break-even oil price, the minimum price needed for a project to be economically viable on the y-axis. Takeaway from this is that a 2-degree carbon budget is basically maxed out at oil of about $60 to $75 a barrel. So everything above that arguably is hard to square with a 2-degree scenario. And certainly oil that's above this $80 to $95 a barrel level is very hard to square with a 2-degree scenario. So in our view, arguably this is the most important in company investments that investors should be focused on. Rather than getting the sector entirely, you need to say, let's stop this high cost stuff. Challenge, though, is that companies, you want to get at the high cost stuff, but companies vary in their exposure to high cost carbon, both in absolute and in relative terms. Just as one illustration of this, I looked at 20 oil producers that as of January 2014 were in the New School's portfolio of public long-only equity managers. 20 stocks the new school owned as of January 2014. What we see here, this is looking at those companies, their exposure over the next 10 years to capital expenditures on oil production that's above that $80 a barrel threshold that we said is outside the 2-degree level. These are, left axis is absolute exposure, billions of dollars. Right axis is relative exposure, how much of their capital expenditures. Takeaway is this: 20 companies, over half of this high-cost oil related to 2 of them. That's Petrobras and PetroChina. And most of it is in Petrobras, in the ultra-deepwater pre-salt reserves off the coast of Brazil. So this, not really to the new school in particular, but just any investor. All right, I'm going to reduce high-cost carbon. Do I need to get rid of all these stocks? It's really 2 of them that are doing half of the problem. And moreover, we'll get to this in a second, the majority owners of these companies are the governments of Brazil and China. Is my selling this stock going to have an effect on what these companies are going to do? These are just the kind of questions that once you go beneath the slogans and the rhetoric and you dig into the portfolios that you need to begin grappling with. That's the high cost point. Let's now talk about the second point I mentioned, which is the effect of divestment actually on company behavior. And you can see, I got here, there are, not surprisingly, opposing views from divestment advocates and divestment skeptics on this topic. You got Bill McKibben up here from his Rolling Stone article, none of these views are naive. Everyone recognizes it's hard, but Bill McKibben says basically, look, it's challenging, but we have a chance, and this is our best opportunity. Selling these companies is our best opportunity. On the other end of the spectrum is the CIA of CalSTRS, one of the biggest US pension funds. CalSTRS divested as a result of California law from apartheid in the 1980s, divested voluntarily from tobacco in the 1990s. And in their position, the takeaway is basically, we divested twice, both times we lost money, neither time did it have any effect on the companies from which we divested. That's their perspective. So I think important to recognize there are questions about the effect on company behavior. But if you're not going to affect the company via selling, what do you do? Nothing? Okay, well, no, we're going to. That's where you say, all right, well, maybe we can try to engage with the company and sit down, dialogue, shareholder resolutions, change their behavior that way. What's the potential for this to have an impact? Again, conflicting views, both of which have perhaps some validity. Divestment advocates say, look, engaging with companies is a good idea, can be effective in some limited instances, which I'll talk about. But it has never and will never address the core problem of the fact that companies are spending billions of dollars a year to develop what we call unburnable carbon. You're never going to change the core business model. And that's what the divestment advocates would say. Well, the divestment skeptics would at times acknowledge much of that, but say, look, if everyone sells, if everyone who cares about climate change divests from fossil fuel companies, then by definition, those companies will be owned exclusively by people who don't care about climate change. And therefore, we know we ain't going to have an effect on the business models because there won't even be the opportunity to. So these are the debates. Let's now look, though, what does the record actually show? I think the record is, it's fair to say it's mixed. I mean, some organizations, one of our peer groups that we work with frequently, Ceres, which some of you may know, environmental group in Boston, has done tremendous work on shareholder engagement with companies generally and with fossil fuel companies in particular, and has made real strides, for example, getting these companies to adopt better, more consistent, more robust disclosures with respect to climate. BP and Shell are in the process of adopting much more robust disclosure policy, Statoil likely to follow suit, and that, for investors, that really is important. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that there has not been a successful effort or much of an effort, really, to address this core problem of the fact that companies, billions, hundreds of billions of each year, developing reserves that if used, could be damaging to the planet. That's the lay of the land. That's the status quo. I want to close, though, by offering 2 reasons that I think the potential for more assertive shareholder engagement actually is picking up and deserves to be looked at very carefully. First one is that investors recognize everything that's been happening, and they're getting savvier and trying to focus more on putting forth shareholder resolutions that actually address the main thing, this investment in unburnable carbon. So 2 resolutions, one that a group called As You Sow out in California submitted with Chevron, another that fund, Arjuna Capital, submitted with Exxon that addressed this core problem. They say to the companies, look, in light of potential restrictions on carbon emissions and transition away from fossil fuels, growing risks to many of your high-cost projects, so what you need to do is adopt a policy that puts less money into developing those projects and more money returned to shareholders via buybacks and dividends, what we call a shrink-to-grow strategy. Just for order of magnitude, Chevron last year, for example, spent 3 times as much on its capital expenditures as it did returning cash to shareholders. So this is the kind of resolution you need. Now, these resolutions, they just have been submitted. The SEC actually, despite the fact the resolutions are almost identical, the SEC threw out the Exxon one, kept the Chevron one. I need my colleague Bevis Longstreth to explain the reasoning behind that one. But this, the Chevron one will be actually on the ballot at the Chevron annual general meeting. Now, that's great. Will it pass? Will it do anything? I think it's hard to say. We'll have to wait and see. But I'll say the second part of this, and why I'm optimistic about the potential for more assertive engagement, is that I'm hopeful that in the future, these kind of resolutions will get a more thorough hearing at the board level of these companies. This is a second notable development, what's called the Boardroom Accountability Project. This is an effort led by our very own New York City Comptroller, Scott Stringer, to change the way that corporate directors are elected. So generally, investors, if you're an investor in a company, you vote on slates of candidates that are submitted by management. It's one of the reasons why the re-election rate for corporate directors of U.S. public companies is I think, higher than the re-election rate for the U.S. House of Representatives. It's like 98%. Each year, the only thing that's different is the directors are 1 year older. This is investors saying, we got to change this. So it's an effort to say if you've owned 3% or more of a company for a year or more, to give an investor or a group of investors the right to nominate up to a quarter of a company's board. These resolutions have been filed with 75 companies, including 33 from the fossil fuel industry, and the SEC so far has not thrown these out. These are staying on the ballot, and at the end of, come the fall, there could be real changes afoot in how directors to these companies are elected. That's significant because it opens up the possibility for creating more climate-competent boards of directors. So on all of the key metrics, from science to policy, most critically with respect to their capital expenditure policies, boards that are more open to a climate-secure, enlightened approach of returning more cash to shareholders and investing less of it in high-cost projects. This, I think, is strong potential and is a significant development. Many groups are focused on this. Series is one of them, an initiative called the 50/50 Project, which is a grouping with 50 large investment funds to focus on 50 key climate change companies, is trying to help to reform the boards of these companies. And this, to me, is a very significant development that may open the possibility for investors, without divesting, to have a significant impact on the climate practices of companies. So with that, I'll conclude. My concluding thoughts are really a restatement of my key takeaways here. Divestment, has been adopted by a cross-section of investors, will continue to be adopted by some, a lot of public attention. That said, significant limits, I think, because of it being a very broad solution, because of investors not wanting to get into fossil fuel holdings, because of investors having questions about the actual effect on fossil fuel companies. So alongside the divestment movement, it's important to recognize, I think, appreciate, and support the growth of these more assertive forms of shareholder engagement via resolutions that target capital expenditures, via trying to change composition of boards. And both of these, all of these, this whole spectrum, divestment, partial divestment, engagement, will be strategies that investors are likely to use more actively in coming years to address climate risk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have Aryeh Neier, please.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about sanctions as a means of promoting human rights. And I do so as someone who has devoted most of his career to trying to promote human rights. And I have therefore been an advocate on behalf of sanctions in a number of cases in which I thought that the effect would be to promote human rights. And I'm going to focus on a few cases. Three of the cases on which I'm going to focus are, I think, success stories in terms of using sanctions as a means of promoting human rights. One is a failure. The three success stories I have in mind are a country that is not often discussed when we talk about this subject, and that is Poland. A second country is South Africa, and I do so with some hesitation because Richard Goldstone is scheduled to speak a little later in the afternoon, and I defer to Richard very much so in terms of knowledge of South Africa. I'm also going to speak about Burma, and then another country where I need to defer to another speaker at this conference is the failure, and that is China. And I very much defer to Andrew Nathan in terms of knowledge of the situation so far as China is concerned. But I'll give you my perspective as an advocate of human rights. Let me first say that, as the previous speakers have already indicated, there are many reasons why sanctions are imposed. Sanctions are imposed to counter aggression, to try to stop terrorism as a means of trying to stop subversion, as a means of trying to limit drug trafficking, as a way to try to control nuclear proliferation. When one talks about sanctions for the promotion of human rights, it has to be recognized that quite a number of the countries that have been targets of sanctions on other grounds are also countries with very poor human rights records. So countries such as North Korea and Iran and Cuba and Russia have been the targets of sanctions. They all have very bad human rights records, but they weren't targets of sanctions on human rights grounds or primarily on human rights grounds. And therefore, I don't think it's appropriate to think of them as one discusses the impact of sanctions on human rights. I think it's only appropriate to consider the countries where the human rights concern is the basis for sanctions. And also, of course, there are many reasons why sanctions are imposed. One that has already been cited is that sanctions can do harm to the people in a country who are not themselves responsible for human rights abuses. They may be the victims of human rights abuses by the government. And so why should they be the sufferers as a consequence of sanctions? And the most extreme example was cited by Professor Drezner, and that is the case of Iraq. I would say, with respect to the case of Iraq, I think it's a debatable case other than on the basis that Madeleine Albright spoke, and that is there was actually substantial income coming into Saddam Hussein's Iraq during the period of sanctions. Saddam Hussein chose to spend that income on more palaces for himself and on a larger amount of military equipment. The fact that the Iraqi, or a segment of the Iraqi population, suffered was more due to Saddam Hussein's policies than to the sanctions themselves. At the same time, I would say that from a human rights standpoint, when one advocates sanctions, one always argues that they should not cover those things which are necessary to meet basic human needs, that food supplies, medical supplies should never be the subject of sanctions. And I would even go further. I would say that if one can say that by overall impact on the income of a country, one is causing harm to people in terms of having adequate food or adequate health care, the very countries that support sanctions ought to be willing to provide assistance specifically designed to address those problems. And the other arguments that are made against sanctions are that it provides business advantages for those who do not participate in the sanctions. It harms the businesses of the countries that impose the sanctions. It curtails contacts between the country that imposes the sanctions and those within the country, and it is thought that those contacts could themselves be a means of promoting human rights within the country. It sometimes allows authoritarian leaders in a country to exploit the existence of sanctions as a means of reinforcing their own authority and playing the nationalist card in response to sanctions. And an argument that was used particularly in the days when sanctions were being proposed with respect to China after the crackdown at Tiananmen Square, that it would inhibit the emergence of a middle class, and it was the middle class that would ultimately bring human rights to China. Frankly, I'm not very impressed with those arguments. The one argument against sanctions, which I do take very seriously, however, is the harm that would befall those who are not themselves the persons responsible for the human rights abuses. And I do think in imposing sanctions, one needs to devise ways to minimize that harm and to try to do whatever one can, even to compensate for that harm by trying to protect the persons who are the victims of sanctions. Now let me turn now to the particular cases that I mentioned. And I start because it's the one that took place longest ago with Poland. In December 1981, the Polish government imposed martial law. And that was marked by very severe abuses of human rights. Among other things, some 30,000 people were arrested and imprisoned at the time that martial law was declared. And the United States unilaterally opposed sanctions on Poland. The European countries were not willing to do so. It was the Reagan administration which was in office at that time, and I'm not ordinarily an admirer of the Reagan administration's performance with respect to human rights, but I did think they managed the sanctions against Poland extremely well. First, and here again I refer to what Professor Drezner had to say, he talked about the need to be clear as to the reasons for sanctions. And the Reagan administration was absolutely clear. That is, the first goal was release all those prisoners And in addition, they wanted the Polish government to enter into a dialogue with the Catholic Church and to recognize solidarity and enter into a dialogue with solidarity. What happened after that is that the Polish government gradually complied with the conditions of the sanctions. And one has to go back and sort of discuss why unilateral American sanctions had such a significant effect on Poland. Poland was somewhat different from the other communist countries in the sense that the Catholic Church had remained independent of the government throughout the communist period. Polish farmers had resisted collectivization, and there was a large Polish immigrant community in the United States which promoted contact between Poland and the United States. And so there was, despite the fact that it was a Warsaw Pact country named for Poland's capital, it was a country which did quite a lot of business with the United States before the imposition of martial law. Another characteristic, and this is something that is debatable, is that it is possible that the Jaruzelski government in Poland imposed martial law as a way of heading off a crackdown on solidarity by the Soviet Union. That is, Poland wanted to do itself rather than bring the Russians into Poland. And preserving a relationship with the United States may have been important to the Polish government as part of their way of limiting Soviet authority over Poland. Gradually, prisoners were released, and as prisoners were released, the United States progressively lifted sanctions. There were very small things. They resumed, or they allowed the Polish shipping fleet to resume fishing in United States territorial waters. At a certain point, they allowed LOT Polish Airlines to resume landing at Kennedy Airport. And one by one, the sanctions were lifted as the Polish government began to comply with the very clear conditions for lifting the sanctions. The final sanctions were lifted, and that was those were the most important sanctions. The United States had blocked Polish accession to the International Monetary Fund, and that was lifted when the last two political prisoners were released out of those who had been imprisoned in the initial crackdown on solidarity. Along the way, the Poles had at times arrested additional people, and when they arrested additional persons, certain sanctions were reimposed and then lifted again as the Poles complied. That eventually created the opportunity for what were called the roundtable discussions in Poland, and eventually, as a consequence of those discussions, elections were held in Poland, and the communists were entirely voted out of office. And that really was the most important factor in triggering the revolutions that took place in Eastern Europe during the late 1980s. Partisans of Reagan like to say that Reagan brought the Berlin Wall down and the communist control of Eastern Europe to an end by his Star Wars policy. I have always thought that was nonsense. But in fact, the Reagan administration did play an immensely important role in bringing an end to communism in Eastern Europe. And I think they did so more through the very effective management of the sanctions against Poland after the imposition of martial law. So far as South Africa is concerned, and that is the next in the historical list, the sanctions were preceded in the United States by a period in which students on American college campuses sought divestment. That is, they wanted the endowments of colleges, and this was also true of church members who wanted the endowments of the various religious policies, to disinvest in companies that did business in South Africa. And in fact, the disinvestment campaign on college campuses was one of the reasons for the emergence of a significant human rights movement in the United States. And that eventually led to an effort to obtain sanctions against South Africa. Ronald Reagan vetoed sanctions against South Africa. And in 1986, the Congress adopted sanctions over Reagan's veto. And I think that was a very significant development. I don't think it was the financial pressure of the sanctions themselves that had a really major impact on what took place in South Africa. I think it was the combination of the sanctions effort and a number of other things that took place. An international sports boycott probably also played a very significant role. Many countries are sports mad. I think South Africa challenges any other country in terms of its devotion to sports, and not having South African athletes able to take part in various international competitions weighed quite heavily in South Africa. But I think the combination of the sanctions, the divestment campaign, the sports boycott tended to signal to South Africa that it had become a pariah in international affairs. The transformation in South Africa eventually took place in February 1990 with the release of Nelson Mandela from prison and the government's decision to legalize the African National Congress. I can't prove this, but I think that one of the factors that played a role in what took place then is that after the sanctions and after the divestment campaign and the international sports boycott, one had the fall of the Berlin Wall and the ending of the Cold War. And I think South Africa always regarded itself as a bastion of the West in the struggle with the East. And with the ending of the Cold War in 1989, and with South Africa being labeled as a pariah by all of these developments, it seems to me that the South African government understood that it would no longer be considered a part of the West. It would be permanently a pariah state unless it did something about bringing apartheid to an end. And so I think all those things in combination, helped to contribute to the events that took place in South Africa in February of 1990. And I think that illustrates another of the important elements of sanctions. Poland indicated the importance of clarity. Poland indicated the importance of, or the possible importance of a gradual process, a calibrated process in which one doesn't have an all or nothing approach, but one brings sanctions gradually to an end. South Africa indicated that it's not only the economic consequences of sanctions. It is that sanctions become a way of stigmatizing a state, or they can become a way of stigmatizing a state, and it is the stigma that has as significant effect, and sometimes a more significant effect than the actual economic consequences of sanctions. I don't disparage the importance of the economic consequences, but they're not the only consequence of sanctions. And one could even say that even the debate about sanctions, whether or not sanctions are imposed, can have that effect. From a human rights standpoint, one of the things that one always tries to do is bring attention to human rights abuses. The principal method that has been evolved for trying to promote human rights worldwide is referred to as naming and shaming. That is, gathering information on human rights abuses and disseminating that information. But it's necessary to get that information actually heard. And it is heard if it takes place in a debate over sanctions. And sanctions, because they inevitably lead to those kinds of debates, serve the human rights purpose by bringing attention to abuses. In the case of Burma, sanctions lasted for a very long time. They lasted from the early 1990s, essentially up to the present. And it's only in the last few years that a transformation has been underway in Burma. A democratization process has taken place. Political prisoners have been released, and there is some greater protection of human rights. There are also continuing human rights abuses in Burma as against the Muslim minority, particularly against the ethnic group known as the Rohingyas. But the transformation that took place in Burma, I think, is inconceivable without the sanctions that lasted for a very long time. My view as to what ultimately made the sanctions effective in the case of Burma is that I think that Burma found itself in need, or thought it was in need, of getting a substantial amount of military equipment from China, and purchased far more than it could afford from China. Eventually, the Chinese insisted on payment for all the military equipment they provided to Burma. And one way that the Burmese paid for the military equipment is they allowed Chinese truckers and loggers to come into to Burma to cut down what were the best remaining hardwood forests in Asia, which were extremely valuable. In the process, creating a variety of problems for Burma. A large prostitution industry grew up along the trucking routes in Burma, and HIV spread very rapidly in Burma, very much driven by the prostitution industry and the role of the long-distance truckers who were taking out the valuable timber from Burma. And I think what happened in Burma is that the country eventually saw itself with a choice. It could either become a vassal state for China, or it could do something that would lead to the removal of the sanctions. And I don't think in imposing the sanctions in the first instance, anyone really imagined what kinds of pressures this might ultimately lead to in Burma. But it did lead to a transformation that began not very long ago, and that is still unfolding at this particular moment. Finally, let me talk about the failure, and that is China. The question of sanctions against China came up as a result of an accident of timing. The accident of timing was that the crackdown at Tiananmen Square in 1989 took place on the night of June 3rd, 4th. And the United States has had legislation going back to 1984 known as the Jackson-Vanik Act. And the Jackson-Vanik Act was initially adopted as a means of punishing the Soviets for restricting emigration by Soviet Jews. It is about human rights only in the sense that its preamble has a broad reference to human rights, but the only actual human right that it talks about is the right to emigrate, which is not an issue so far as China is concerned. Nevertheless, there was a particular date by which the president every year would have to certify that China complied with the conditions of the Jackson-Vanik Act in order to allow most favored nation status to continue. And it happened to be June 3rd. And so the president would have to sign off on China's right to most favored nation status just on the anniversary of the crackdown on Tiananmen Square. And that's what tied the question of denying China most favored nation status to the question of the crackdown on Tiananmen Square. And there was a brief period in which human rights advocates tried to promote the idea that China should be denied most favored nation status. That was before China had become the mega power economically that it is today. In those days, one could think of the United States as having the wherewithal to punish China for human rights violations. Things look very different a quarter of a century later than they did at that time. But for a brief period, this was a cause for the human rights movement. And a few of us in the human rights field worried that this wasn't going to last very long. And so we thought of emulating what the Reagan administration had done with respect to Poland. That is, not go for an all-or-nothing denial of most favored nation status, but have a very selective denial. And something that could be modified if the human rights situation improved, and which could be tightened if the human rights situation deteriorated. Nancy Pelosi, who was not yet a power in the Congress of the United States, represented the San Francisco area with the largest Chinese-American population in the United States. And so she became the sponsor of legislation to provide that kind of approach to sanctions against China. And her legislation was approved in both houses of Congress. And then it was vetoed by President George H.W. Bush, The legislation was passed over Bush's veto in the Senate of the United States, and it got a vote of, I'm sorry, in the House of Representatives. In the Senate, it got 59 votes in favor and 40 votes against. And so it failed to get the 2/3 majority that was needed to override Bush's veto. And then a few years after that, President Bill Clinton delinked most favored nation status and human rights in China, and said he would no longer try to press for limiting China's most favored nation status. What has happened since then, again, is that China has acquired such immense economic power that it's unthinkable to impose sanctions on China. If anything, what has happened is China has become the first country that I know of to turn things around. It uses economic sanctions in the other direction. That is, those who denounce human rights abuses in China can become the targets of China's economic sanctions. So Denmark has been a sponsor of resolutions at the United Nations on human rights abuses in China, and China has threatened and perhaps has carried out economic sanctions against Denmark. The Danes did point out that they didn't do much business with China and that it wasn't going to have any significant impact on them. China also threatened Norway to try to head off the Nobel Prize to Liu Xiaobo. Probably no country in the world is more invulnerable to sanctions than Norway. It has the largest sovereign fund in the world, and Norway could brush off the threats from China. But many other countries are not in the same position, and they mute their voices so far as human rights in China is concerned, because China is ready to use economic sanctions against those who denounce human rights abuses. At any rate, I've gone on a long time. Winding up, let me simply say that the lessons I learned from these experiences is, one, you've got to be concerned with the people who will actually be the victims of human rights abuses, and you've got to try to protect them against those abuses by dealing with the question of basic human needs. If smart sanctions will work, so be it. But if you can't use smart sanctions effectively, find ways to shield the people who would be the victims. The second lesson is you've got to be clear as to the rationale for imposing sanctions for human rights abuses. The third lesson is try not to do it, or don't do it on an all or nothing basis. Do it on a basis where if there are improvements, you can modify the sanctions. If things get worse, you can increase the sanctions. But dealing with sanctions on that basis is more likely to be effective and will better protect human rights. Thank you.